Principles of Management, Chapter 2, Values, Attitudes, Emotions, and Culture. One of the things we're going to look at is personality traits and how that applies to managers and their employees. Personality trait is something that it's more than just a mood, which tends to be temporary. Personality trait is something that's more permanent or enduring. It doesn't mean permanent in the sense that it's never going to change because people do evolve over time, but they are enduring, they are kind of regular, the way that you think, feel, or act in certain situations. A manager's personality will influence their behavior and the way that they view other people and respond to them. No single trait is right or wrong, although there are some preferred traits. Just because you have a personality that doesn't necessarily fit into whatever perceived model would be appropriate doesn't mean that you would be inappropriate to be able to manage a particular group of people. Or contrary to that, if you're an employee, it doesn't mean that you wouldn't be able to do particular types of work. It's very similar to the personality traits that you see from things like the Myers-Briggs personality test, which, by the way, is somewhat controversial in terms of how effective it is in determining whether or not someone's personality is that particular type and what that type may mean for the work that they do. Effectiveness, which means the ability to get the job done, is determined by this complex interaction between the way managers look at their job, the way that they respond to certain situations, and the way that they deal with other people and their personalities as well. Slide 5 talks about the big 5 personality traits. They are extroversion, negative affectivity, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and open to experience. Some scholars don't necessarily agree with these 5 traits being the big 5, but it is something that has been standard for quite some time, so you should be aware of it. The first of the big 5 personality traits is extroversion. This means that people tend to enjoy going out with other people, being kind of the center of attention. They're more outgoing. The one way that you can really look at whether or not you're an extrovert is whether or not you gain energy from situations in which you are required to be outgoing and interact with people. If you are an extrovert, you would get a positive emotion from doing things about yourself and interacting with other people. If you have a high level of extroversion, you would be sociable, affectionate, outgoing, and friendly. That doesn't mean that introverts aren't affectionate or friendly. It just means that these are kind of the generalizations that they put into this category. Personally, as someone who tests very high on the introversion standards, I don't think that there's necessarily an exclusion here where if you're an introvert, that doesn't mean that you're not going to be a good manager. Some of the best managers and leaders of all businesses in the United States and around the world tend to be introverted. I don't think Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg are particularly outgoing and friendly. They probably come high on the introversion scale. But it just means these are things that you need to be aware of. It doesn't mean that it's good or bad. It's whether or not you fall into this category so that we can start to analyze behavior. Negative affectivity is the tendency to experience negative emotions. You tend to overreact. That's kind of a loaded term, but you tend to feel distressed. You may be critical of yourself. You may be critical of others. You may be kind of a negative viewpoint on the way things are. If you feel angry or dissatisfied at work, if a certain problem arises and you're not able to deal with it particularly well, then you may be high in negative affectivity. If you're low in it, you're not going to be as pessimistic. You're going to be less critical of yourselves and possibly of others. Low negative affectivity is considered to be a better solution here because if you have problems at work, you wouldn't necessarily get bogged down in dealing with things that are extraneous regarding your emotions. You're able to more focus on the situation at hand and come up with some type of a solution. Agreeableness, if you are high in agreeableness, that means that you're likable, affectionate, and care about others. If you are low, you're distrustful, unsympathetic, uncooperative, or antagonistic. Here, again, we would prefer people, probably as a manager, to be high in agreeableness. Being agreeable does not necessarily mean that you just say yes to everything. You can still say no if someone asks you something that you don't think is reasonable, but the nature of the way that you react is whether or not you are high in agreeableness or low in agreeableness. If someone comes up and has an idea that they would like to pursue that you don't think would work, if you're high in agreeableness, you would still say no. You wouldn't necessarily have to agree, but you would still do it in a manner that people would not be put off by it. If you are low in agreeableness, even if it's a good idea, you may not even want to go through with it because you don't trust the people that are saying it to you. You're always looking for, the glass half empty type of situation where you may not even be able to assess things appropriately and therefore miss good opportunities that are available to you. Conscientiousness is someone who is capable of doing their job without necessarily being told. You're careful, scrupulous, you persevere, If you have high levels of conscientiousness, you tend to be more organized and more self-disciplined. You can get the work done on your own without being prodded to do so. If you are low in conscientiousness, you may be kind of a procrastinator. You don't really spend a lot of time focusing on the work that you need to do. You have a lack of direction and self-discipline. And in a manager, having low conscientiousness could be a problem, especially if you have employees that work for you that are also low in conscientiousness. Employees and managers that have high levels of conscientiousness tend to be the types that are capable of doing the work without always having someone look over their shoulder. They take the initiative and they solve problems. Openness to experience is the last of the 5 personality traits. If you are willing to listen to new ideas, come up with new ways of doing things, be open to reasonable change, then you probably would rank relatively high. You would be innovative in decision making because you'd be willing to look at facts and other issues and compare processes that are different than the way that you do it and try to assess whether or not they would be beneficial. If you are low in openness to experience, you tend to be less likely to take risks. There's a few ways to be able to deal with risk, by the way. So 4 main ways to deal with risk is you can accept the risk, meaning you just don't care what's going to happen. It's a risk that's there and you're going to just deal with it. You can mitigate risk, which is you recognize that there is a risk and you can try to lower it. You can avoid the risk, which is to simply not take any risk. It would be truly risk averse. And the last one would be that you could pass that risk on to someone else. The example about risk that I give to most of my classes is driving. Every time you get in your car and you drive, there is a risk that you could be in an accident, you could be seriously injured and even killed. The 4 ways of addressing that is you could just accept the risk, jump in your car and drive and do whatever you want, and just say if it happens, it happens. You could mitigate the risk. You could wear seatbelts. You could drive the speed limit, drive defensively, be careful. You could pass that risk on to someone else, which is basically insurance. So you pay a premium, and if there's an accident, you have some way to resolve that risk by having another person under contract assume that risk in your place. You could also just avoid the risk entirely and just not get out of bed in the morning and not go to work, which really wouldn't be very appropriate. So openness to experience is related to risk and how you assess it. Ideally, you would be willing to take reasonable risks. You don't want to take risks that are going to bankrupt your company or put people at risk or potentially in risk of harm, but you want to make good, reasonable decisions. And if you are risk averse because you are not open to experience, then you would not be willing to take the types of steps that might be necessary to succeed. Slide 11 just is a kind of a sample where you can do a self-assessment and determine where you may fall on the spectrum, where your strengths and weaknesses, whether you're high or low in a particular field of one of these big 5 personality traits are. So you can take a pen and paper and do the math and do a self-assessment. Even if it's not 100% accurate, it's not an unworthwhile thing to do, to be able to do a little bit of a self-assessment, because the more aware you are of these things, even if it's, like I said, not 100% accurate, being aware of it will help make you more cognizant of the fact that different personality types exist, and it can give you some clues about how to respond in certain situations. When we're talking about personalities, people tend to have several types of traits that are important. One is the internal locus of control. That means that you focus on yourself. The trait from within is kind of overarching. You have a tendency to locate the responsibility for yourself. If it happens, it's because I'm driving. If it's something that needs to get done, I'm going to do it myself. I don't necessarily need to be cajoled or influenced or prodded to do it. My own actions and behaviors are really the key figures here, or the key factors for me to be able to get my job accomplished. If you have an external locus of control, that would be you would look to the outside for motivation, or you would look to the outside for the impetus to do some work. If you have an external locus of control, you tend to not really think that you are in control of your own fate and that it's just subject to the way other things are playing out. In reality, most people are never one or the other. Most people have a little bit of internal drive and they are also influenced on the outside. Some people tend to be more one than the other, and it's worthwhile to understand that that may be the case, so that when you're dealing with people, or even when you're judging yourself about how you should respond to something, knowing this can help improve your decision making. Other personality traits to review, talking about self-esteem, how confident you are, how good you feel about yourself, and your ability to do the job. If you have a high level of self-esteem, you see yourself as competent, capable, able to do the work, you are able to rise to challenges, assuming that the challenges are things that you can actually accomplish. There's the downside of having super high self-esteem, which is, again, tied to risk. You could go into a situation where you may think that you are infallible, but it could be something that you're not capable of doing. So you don't want to have any kind of a level of overconfidence or hubris. You need to be able to look at the situation and make good, reasonable decisions. If you are confident in yourself, you will tend to be able to take a little bit more of that reasonable risk, which is acceptable. If you have a low level of self-esteem, you tend to have a poor opinion of yourself, your abilities. You may also have more of that external locus of control. You feel that your fate is subject to some other people. It's important to point out that low self-esteem, high self-esteem, external locus of control, internal locus of control, these create some kind of a spectrum where most people will fall through some kind of combination. The need for achievement is whether or not someone is really driven by performing challenging tasks in order to do well and prove to themselves and to the rest of the world that they're doing really well. It's a little bit related to that internal locus of control. However, again, too much of anything is probably not great. If you are driven solely by a need to achieve, you may be ignoring other things that are important and paying attention to the wrong things as a manager. Again, being cognizant of these personality traits is the key. You're not going to be able to figure it out. There's so many variables involved with personality, but you can start to minimize the risk of making any mistakes or misattributions by figuring out how personalities work and being aware of them. The need for affiliation is the level at which you need to have interpersonal relationships, being liked, having people get along. If you have a low level of a need for affiliation, you may be probably more introverted or have that less of an extroverted big five personality trait. Even the most introverted people do have a need for affiliation. So again, I don't want anybody to look at this like it's black and white or up and down. It's usually there's a spectrum and you fall somewhere on it. One of the personality traits that you do need to pay attention to is how much do people need to be associated with other people. Certain jobs, if you're in sales, you always have to work with other people. If you're working on teams, you're going to have to work with other people. If you have a high level of need for affiliation, it's probably going to be a little bit easier for you. If you have a low level of a need for affiliation, you may need to work on that, but it doesn't mean that you would not be appropriate as a manager in certain circumstances. The need for power is something that's there as well that you need to be aware of. Some people are driven by that need to achieve, and they also are achieving as a means to acquire power so that they can tell other people what to do and to be completely in control. Again, the need for power in small doses is probably a good thing, and it's a motivating factor for some people. But if your entire professional outlook is driven by the need for power, then you typically would start to make some mistakes and make decisions that would not be best for the organization or yourself or your employees for that matter. People who are completely driven by power will put down others. They'll not give credit to their employees. It can create strife and some conflict. So you have to be aware that the need for power by itself is not a bad thing, but if it becomes the overarching goal, it can lead to bad results. Next, we're going to discuss attitudes, values, and moods and emotions. Values are very related to organizational culture and culture in general, meaning the culture of a state, a region, a country, a group of people. They can have their own cultures. Organizations have their own culture too, and they're all kind of based on the same thing. When you have a group of people that believe very commonly, that believe in similar sets of rules and the way things that should be done, then they will develop a culture and standards and norms that they would be able to operate under. We'll talk about organizational culture in a few more slides, but the values are what you look at as a way that you think that you should behave. What is valuable to you, what you think is important, what kind of principles you stand for. An attitude is a thought or a feeling about a specific job or the organization. The way that you view something, it can be positive, it can be negative. Again, this is related to positive and negative affectation. But your attitude is really, can we get the job done? Can we not get the job done? Moods and emotions, we'll talk about that again in another couple of slides, but it's how you feel. This is not related to necessarily personality, and moods and emotions tend to be more transitory. They are not permanent. You may have a bad mood on a particular day or for a portion of a day, and it could resolve. That is related to some degree of your values and attitudes. They tend to be more of a baseline. The way that you view things and your attitudes will be pretty consistent. But you can also have fluctuations in it. If your moods and emotions are positive or negative, it may affect the way that you view your values and attitudes at that particular moment. Terminal values are the things that you have that tend to be more permanent. They're lifelong goals or objectives that you're seeking to do over the long term. Instrumental values are ways of behavior that you are trying to adhere to. Under values, we also have norms. These, again, is very much related to culture, whether culture with a capital C, like your region or your country. They will have norms, but organizations will too. And it's largely based on the founders of the organization, the senior managers, the managers, and the employees. When you have this unwritten informal rules of conduct, the way that people should act, you also have the formal way of doing it, but the norms kind of arrive from the formal values. But there are also unwritten rules, the way that people interact, holding the door open for someone else, going in and out of the office. These are just ways that you understand that people should behave. You don't necessarily have to write it down. The value system is the terminal and instrumental values that are guiding principles in your life. So when you have a value system of your own, it's pretty much a synopsis of the way you look at things and what is important to you and the way that you behave in order to achieve those things that are important to you. Going a little bit deeper into attitudes, an attitude is a collection of feelings and beliefs. They are very closely related to job satisfaction, as an example. So if you like your current job, you may be considered to be satisfied. You are happy with the work. It's challenging, but not overly stressful. You are paid enough to be satisfied. Typically, job satisfaction is something that managers are hoping to get their employees to recognize and to provide them a circumstance so that they can be satisfied in their jobs. Because employees with low satisfaction in their jobs tend to check out. They don't work extra. They don't do any extra level. They kind of do what's necessary to get by. And if they're truly dissatisfied, they can start withdrawing from the work that they do. They start not attending meetings or, again, doing the bare minimum. They call out sick every chance they get. They take vacation. They come to work late. They leave early. They don't interact with people the way that they might have when they were satisfied. And ultimately, the highest level of withdrawal is that they end up quitting. And if this is a valuable employee that can do some work that you really can get an advantage for against the competition, keeping them satisfied is a way of also keeping them employed with you so that you can get the advantage of the skill set that they have to offer. If you're a manager that's high on satisfaction, you will like your job, you think you're being treated fairly. And again, this relates to your employees as well. If you treat your employees in a manner that they can also feel like they like their jobs, they're being treated fairly, their job has purpose and meaning, then they will have higher levels of satisfaction and they will be more likely to stay with the organization. Slide 22 has a couple of ways that you can look at job satisfaction. You can go through the information on the slide and do another little bit of a self-assessment to see if any job that you have or have had, how you would rate it, essentially. Organizational citizenship behaviors, again, these are not necessarily required of organizational members, but they are important and necessary for organizational efficiency and effectiveness. We have talked a little bit before about what efficiency and effectiveness are. Effectiveness, again, is getting the job done. Efficiency is being effective by using the least amount of resources necessary. That's highly correlated to productivity. So if you get the job done and you don't spend a lot of time or money to do it and you do it well, then you can do more work and that would be a higher level of productivity. And if you're more productive than the competition, you're going to have an advantage over them and be more successful. A competitive advantage is when you are able to access all of your resources and put them to work. And because you have better resources, because you have better processes, even if your competition is working at 100% of their potential efficiency, you are able to do better than them because you either have better equipment, better employees, or better processes in place so that you're more efficient, you're more productive, and that is a competitive advantage. Once you achieve a competitive advantage, you have to work to be able to keep it because a lot of businesses are copycats. If you come up with a way of doing something, someone else is going to figure it out sooner or later. You always have to do some reassessments in order to figure out how you're going to be more competitive or have a competitive advantage and maintain that level of efficiency. Technology is always changing. People are changing. You have new employees coming in and out. You have to be aware of that and stay in tune to what's going on in order that you can get that competitive advantage and sustain it. Related to all of that are the types of behaviors that we're looking for. So when you assess what is important for effectiveness, efficiency, and competitive advantages, you're going to be also looking to hire people with particular attitudes and reinforce behaviors and attitudes that lead to that competitive advantage. Organizational commitment is the level that an employee or manager feels committed to the organization. If my boss asks me to do something, I'm going to be willing to do it because I like my job. I have a high level of satisfaction. Typically, if I have a high level of satisfaction, that is correlated to a higher level of organizational commitment. If I have a low level of job satisfaction, I may not be particularly committed to the organization, so I will not be doing things that would be the best interest of the organization. It would be a little bit more self-serving. And again, if you are really dissatisfied with your job, your level of organizational commitment could be so low that you quit and you try to leave, and you could end up going to a competitor where you may be happier. So managers need to be aware that organizational commitment can be a reflection of other things based on your employees' personalities, based on your own personalities, and the level of satisfaction that they hold. A mood is a feeling or a state of mind. An emotion can be intense, but it's relatively short-lived feelings. Moods may last a little bit longer than an emotion. You could see something, a video on YouTube that's funny and you chuckle for a little bit. That may make you happy. It may not be enough to swing the needle on your mood. You could be in a car accident on the way to work. That could put you in a bad mood because you have this bigger deal that you have to work on. You have to call the insurance company. You have to go get your car repaired, all of that stuff. That could put you in a sour mood. So it is a feeling or a state of mind, but typically moods and emotions are not the same as personality. They can be affected by personality traits, but they typically are more transitory. They're not permanent. Slide 26, you can take a look at this and do another little exercise to figure out the measure of positive and negative moods at work. Emotional intelligence could be on the big five personality traits. People who have to work in teams, people who have to interact with others, having a high level of emotional intelligence will give you an advantage because you're able to get a clue about how people are reacting. When you ask someone how they're doing and they say fine, you can kind of read their face, you can hear it in their voice that they may not be that fine. That's an example of emotional intelligence. It's also a way to understand how you are motivated and how you interact with other people. So if you can understand your own moods and your emotions, as well as the moods and emotions of other people, it can help you take a step back before you immediately react to something because you're in a bad mood. Take a deep breath. If you have emotional intelligence, you'll be able to pick up on cues that other people are using to try and figure out how to address particular situations. As I mentioned before, organizational culture is very similar to national culture or regional culture. It's all based on a shared set of beliefs. When you have an insular organization that's doing a particular type of work and you hire people that have the same backgrounds, then you tend to behave in a particular way. Organizational culture, if you go to the opera and you go to a rock concert, you're going to behave differently at the opera than you would at the rock concert. You're going to dress differently to go to a formal gathering than you would to a house party. These are just expectations and shared sets of beliefs. It's also tied a little bit to this emotional intelligence, being able to read the room and understand what fits, what types of comments, what type of behavior would be appropriate. Organizations set up their own organizational culture. You can have a very informal organizational culture, no formal wear at work. You can have casual dress. There are places that let you ride skateboards down the hallway. There are other places that are more buttoned down. Old school law firms, for example, they behave in a particular way. They use a particular vocabulary. You can pick up on the cues and norms pretty much anywhere you go. If you go to a particular restaurant, you can tell what type of culture they have and what type of clientele they're trying to serve. If you go to a very expensive French restaurant that costs a lot of money, that's going to be a lot different than going to McDonald's. Same thing for the organizations. They set your expectations, your values, your norms, the basic way that you do your work. This can be informal and formal if you want to have a good, strong organizational culture, which can help managers. If you have a strong organizational culture that is based on conscientiousness and getting the job done, it makes a manager's job a lot easier because if you have people that understand that that's the culture, they can kind of police themselves a little bit and make the job a little bit easier for managers. But you can put these in a formal set of rules. You can have a mission statement, a vision statement. You can state what your cultural values are. You can do that when you're hiring people too and put a statement similar to that in your job posting so that you are attracting people who may find that culture to be a good fit. The attraction, selection, attrition framework helps explain how personality can influence organizational culture. If you have the attitudes and personalities of the founders, they typically have a big impact, especially on smaller companies that have recently been founded. But they can even have echoes of that going on for some time. The founders 100 years ago from a company can still have an influence on the way people behave because they've hired people, they've trained with people, Even if they're not there anymore, the people that have carried on the work may have these remnants of the way that people have behaved. The founders create the culture. They have a big hand in the culture. They tend to hire employees who have similar personalities. And when that gets established, even when some of those founders or some of those employees leave, the ball has already started rolling, and you start hiring other people who also have similar personalities and have similar work ethics. Terminal values help signify what an organization is trying to accomplish, and you can pass that along to your employees to make sure that they all understand it. When you take a class such as organizational behavior, you'll talk about things like role ambiguity. It's a job of the manager to make sure that people understand what their jobs are so that there's no confusion and they don't waste any time trying to figure it out. If you can let people know right off the bat what the values are, where we're going, what our mission is, what our values are, that can really go a long way in making sure that people are doing the work appropriately. The instrumental values guide how you are going to be operating and achieving your organizational goals. And managers can help figure out what the organizational culture will be. There may be a negative aspect of organizational culture that you can try to address. That's not always very easy to do. Organizational change management can be very difficult. But the idea is that you select some type of value or norm that you want to promote through the organization. You introduce it to people, you reiterate it, you hold people accountable if they don't behave in that particular manner, you train people on it, and you reinforce it going down the road until it becomes part of the established regular norms and values. Some of the things that you can do to help understand what the organizational culture is or to convey that understanding to your staff are things like the values of the founders, which we discussed a little bit, socialization, ceremonies and rites, and stories and language. All of these things contribute to that organizational culture. Socialization is bringing in new employees. You get new hires to come in, the onboarding situation. How do they meet new people? How do you get them to feel like they're at home? It always takes a while to figure out the ins and outs of an organization. Once you get hired, though, if you have a really well-established process to introduce people to the organization, to your coworkers, sure, telling them where the bathroom is located and what the computer systems are and their passwords, all of that is important. But it's also important to make sure that they know what the chain of command is. They need to know how to work with people, have group lunches and team trainings and things like that. You can really start to convey what type of behavior is important and what types of things we're looking for. If an employee does a really good job, obviously it's important for you to recognize that. Having a more formal way of doing that is to have an award ceremony. So if you have an evaluation at the end of the year and a few employees receive awards, you get to have the ceremony where they come up and they announce the work that they did and what award they received. In the military, it's not that uncommon for commissioned officers starting out as second lieutenants and first lieutenants. They get to be promoted. They have a ceremony where they give them their bars to get promoted from lieutenant to captain or from captain to major, whatever it may be. They often have these as formal ceremonies, and it recognizes the work. It also is a message to other people that if you do good work, you will be recognized because this is something that we value. It is part of the value and norms of the organization. That can hold true outside of the military, any organization. You can have ceremonies and rites where you award people, you put people through these processes where you acknowledge what they're doing, and that contributes to the organizational culture because it shows what types of behaviors are rewarded and valued. Breaking that down a little bit further, rites of passage is to determine how you enter, advance, or leave an organization. You should have a hiring onboarding structure. You should have an ongoing job evaluation structure with award ceremonies and corrective action when necessary. When you leave an organization, regardless of the reason, it may be because you have low job satisfaction. It may be that you're moving to another country because you have family there, whatever it may be. You should have some type of process for separation. And when I leave jobs, typically, we go out to dinner, we have drinks, whatever it is. They mention it, they put it in the newsletter. Recognizing what's going on and keeping that as a standard of behavior does contribute to the organizational culture. Rites of integration is to build common bonds among organizational members. Oftentimes, people maybe have an annual conference or a biannual conference. They do things like team building, build up those personal behaviors, those personal relationships that are going to be important that you can rely on the job later on. Again, the rites of enhancement, that tends to go towards what I was talking about before, the reward ceremonies, letting people be recognized, getting the rewards for their contributions, and letting people understand that they did the job and they're recognized for it because they're doing the way that it should be done. and we want other people to emulate that as well. You can put notices in the newsletter, you can put it up on the intranet, give promotions, that type of thing as well. By recognizing it, you are establishing that as part of the criteria for your culture. If you didn't recognize any of that, that would also be part of your culture, but it would also be a lost opportunity to really reinforce the things that are important to the organization. Stories and language, these are related to ceremonies and rites. However, this is more informal. If you've ever had a job where they talk about someone who doesn't work there anymore, I remember this guy, he used to work here, he used to come in at these hours and he did all this work and set these things up. Conversely, it could also be someone who didn't do particularly a great job. But they are stories, almost like myths. If you were looking at regular culture, a national culture or religious culture, there are myths and legends and stories that go on that people talk about. Same type of thing happens within an organization. And if you have positive legends, positive stories, it can prove to be an example for other people to emulate. Just as recognizing the people who are currently there, you can also call out people who may not even be there or people who are not known to you, but you've heard about them. The way people dress, the offices that they're in, the cars that they drive, that also relates to the information that they're trying to convey about what they look for or what is important to them. When you're talking about culture and managerial action, planning is always important, and it's always, in my opinion, one of the things that is overlooked the most. Of the Fortune 500 companies, the ones that tend to perform the best are the ones that spend an inordinate amount of time compared to their peers in planning. You have a project that's going to take a year, it wouldn't be that unusual to spend 2, 3, even 4 months planning it. Because when you plan things out, it's like having blueprints to build an office. You can't just go to Home Depot and buy a whole lot of lumber and then just dig a hole in the ground and try to build something. You want to have a plan. You want to know what types of materials are important, what the blueprints are, what type of licenses are important, who you need to get the work done. All of that is a result of planning. When you have a good plan in place, then it's just a matter of following the recipe. And if something goes wrong, really good planning also has contingencies built in so that if you try to do something and it doesn't work because a product is no longer available or some aspect is not there any longer, then you'll have an alternative. If you don't plan, then you don't know what you're doing and you have to invent it on the fly, which tends to take longer. And if you make a mistake, you will have to go back and start over again. And you also don't have those contingencies built in because you haven't thought through what might happen if certain things don't work out the way that you want. In an innovative organizational culture, you take a flexible approach, encourage the participation of subordinates. Typically, in my opinion, managers who are not doing the actual day-to-day work may become kind of insulated from what is actually going on. And the best way that you can find out how to put your employees in a position to succeed is to talk to them and have them tell you what types of things would actually make sense. Conservative organizational cultures tend to be more top-down management. If you've got someone in a top management position who hasn't actually done the line work for 20 years and technology and other things have changed over that time, they're not going to be as informed as an innovative manager. Now, that's not even necessarily to say that innovative is better than conservative. It really depends on the organization, what your mission and goals are. Sometimes it's better to be told what to do in order to get the job done. And in a certain situation, that may make the most sense. So whether or not you want to be this innovative, more democratic approach and involve your employees or be more top down, it really depends on the nature of your company, the culture that you have, and the work that you're trying to get done, and what would be the best fit to serve that purpose. In terms of organizing, you've already done your planning, so now you're starting to put the plans into effect by doing the organization. If you have an innovative organizational culture, it's more of an organic structure that is flat and decentralized. If you've ever worked for a very large organization, either the military or government or some large private corporations that have maybe tens of thousands of employees, if you look at the organizational chart, some of them can be 50 pages long, and it's very hard to follow what's going on. If you have a very high level, you have a president, a vice president, a regional manager, a supervisor, and then a line supervisor, and then the employees, that's known as a tall organizational structure. A flatter organizational structure eliminates some of the middle management in between so that the chain of command is a little bit quicker. Instead of asking my boss, who has to ask their boss, who has to ask their boss if we can do something, I maybe only have to ask my boss, and they have the ability to say yes. So if you have a flatter organizational culture, you tend to be more responsive, you tend to get things done quicker. The downside of having a flat organizational culture is the middle managers that remain have a wider span of control. That is, they have to manage more people. If you've got a middle manager that had 5 people, and now you've removed a layer of management, that manager may now be managing 8 or 10 people. And that's a much more difficult job. So if you want to have a flat organizational culture with a wider span of control because you're trying to get that efficiency, then you have to make sure that you've got really good managers who are aware of how to manage in that kind of a structure. If you have a very tall organization and you change it to making it flat and you don't train those managers and they're not familiar with it, they may not be able to do the work and it could become even less efficient than it was previously. In a conservative organizational culture, you've got that well-defined hierarchy and the authority, the chain of command, and all of the reporting relationships are there. If it's managed correctly for the purposes that you're trying to do, that may be fine. Again, I'm not saying that an innovative organizational style or conservative organizational style is better. It's whatever suits the purpose of the organization. In terms of leading, innovative leaders and managers, they ask people to take risks and experiment. You have to take that with a grain of salt. Managers should not be telling people to take risks that are outside of their delegated authority. If I have the ability to approve purchases up to $1 million, I can't go out and buy a $10 million piece of property. That's not what we're talking about. Creating some kind of a structure where there is reasonable risk and you can operate within that level of risk, that's okay. So if you want to encourage people to take risks, okay, maybe I'm a manager and I'm going to give you the authority to approve purchases up to $10,000. Maybe you only had $1,000 before. We have to make sure that people are trained and that they understand and that there's no ambiguity about their role and what their delegated authority entails. But if you do that, it allows people to make decisions on their own instead of waiting to have it go through 5 different people on the chain of command. So again, this is similar to having a flatter organizational culture in terms that it's innovative. If you allow your employees to take more risks and you delegate that authority to them, provided that you've trained them on what appropriate risks are, that can be more efficient. In a conservative organizational culture, it's more command and control. The managers use objectives, they monitor the progress towards those goals. The employees typically do not have an awful lot of delegated authority to take risk. It's up to the manager to do it. And again, that may be fine for the purposes of what this company is trying to do. The last bit we're going to talk about for this chapter is controlling. Managers, aside from planning and organizing, controlling is making sure that the employees that report to them are doing the work, that they get appropriate feedback, that you've told them the conditions of what their job is, what their expectations are, so you minimize that role ambiguity. Innovative controlling managers are going to look at multiple different ways of getting a job done. As a manager, I had 15 people working for me at one particular place. I knew that there were about 10 different ways to do a particular task. One thing that what so-called micromanagers do, if you hire a person to be a manager and you hire somebody who is a really high-level performer, but you don't train them on how to be a manager, they tend to fall into this micromanagement trap, where they did it one way and they expect everybody else to do it exactly the same way. That would be more of a conservative organizational culture in terms of controlling for management. A lot of times that micromanagement drives people crazy, and it comes from a position where managers only see one way of doing things and are open to the idea that there are multiple ways of doing something. The way that I personally looked at it is if I gave the same job to 5 different people and they did it 5 different ways, as long as it got done on time, and it was effective, if it was efficient and effective and legal, I don't want anybody getting in trouble doing something or cutting corners. I don't really care how it gets done. In fact, if you have 5 different people doing it 5 different ways and they all get it done, one may be better than the others, and you can have a discussion with them to find out why it works better for some people, and maybe it would work well for others. So that is a way to become more innovative as well, by letting the creativity of your staff drive solutions that could be chosen and then applied and given out to everyone else to follow. Okay, that's the end of chapter 2. We'll pick up chapter 3 next.